Sure, there are lots of tutorials out there for how to do a beaded bezel on a round shape, but how the heck do you do an oval one, or a teardrop, or something like this? I'm going to show how to do this one and give 5 tips so you can make a beaded bezel for any shape you need. If you want to be inspired and grow in your creativity, you're in the right place. Cindy here, welcome to another jewelry tutorial at keepsakecrafts.net. The very first tip I have for you is to lay out your beads and make a plan. Here I have a 15 by 27 millimeter Potomac crystal Navette. It's kind of a marquise shape, really pretty. I will link all the beads that I show in this video in the description box below, or they'll be linked at my blog post. But you can see here, I started planning them out. Now this is the one that I made first. All of the IrisDuos surrounding my Navette are the Crystal Magic wine color, but I actually don't have enough to do another one. So I'm trying to decide what I'm going to do in combination with the Aztec Gold. And there's tip 1B, is don't be afraid to try different combinations if you don't have enough beads. So many of my designs end up being as a result of only having so many beads. So this design is based on clusters of 3. So I've got, in this case, the Aztec Gold beads in the center of each, and I have a pretty general idea of how these are going to fit around this bead and how they'll look in this configuration. But here they are, again, just kind of roughly with all the gold. Or I could do it a different way and make the center one of each of my clusters a red bead. So you just kind of have to play and lay it out. And here it is with the red beads in the center of each of these clusters. And I think I like this better. And that's another tip I have for you, a bonus, is that to make visual decisions visually. Whatever you're doing, beading, quilting, if it's a visual thing, actually lay it out as best you can, and it will really help you to make the decision that you like best. I'm going to do it this way, having a different bead in each of these clusters of 3, because that will help you see what I'm doing. You could substitute other beads here. Any 2-hole bead that has this general shape, maybe a teardrop shape, or even something kind of rectangular. As long as it's kind of a longish 2-hole bead, give it a try. Lay it out first and see if you think it'll work. Now we're ready to start stringing our beads. We're going to start with a stop bead. A stop bead is just a spare bead you have lying around that will give you a little bit of tension as you begin, and you'll remove it later. I always recommend you use a stop bead that is a different color from what you are working with so it doesn't accidentally get sewn into your piece. You just go through it once and then you go back through it again. And you can slide it easily along your thread. You can leave just a little 6-inch tail or so. We're going to start by stringing our groups of 6 IrisDuos. And if you're using 2-hole beads, I recommend you always stick your needle through one hole, then pick it up by the other hole. That way you know you have 2 clear holes. It's really frustrating to have stitched a bead in and then find out much later in the design that the other hole is clogged, which does happen sometimes. So I'm going to go through one grouping of IrisDuos. And then I'm going to pick up an 11-0. And repeat this 5 more times, so you have a total of 18 11-0s, 6 groupings of 3. Now these have a direction. They're flat on one side and rounded on the other, so make sure you pick them up so that all the rounded sides are facing in the same direction. And then an 11-0 in between each group of 3. Here are my 18 IrisDuos, each group of 3 separated with an 11-0. Now I'm going to go back through my first 3 IrisDuos and pull that into a circle. And then step up to the hole, the other hole on the same side of the IrisDuo you just came out of. And then pull it snug. Doesn't have to be crazy tight. Now we're going to make these IrisDuos behave by adding in some crystals. These are 2 by 3 millimeter crystal rondelles. And what we're going to do is add in between each of the IrisDuos of a cluster. So I'm coming out this bead, I'm going to go into the center one, which is red. That's helpful. You can see that that's the center of a cluster of 3. And then also add another crystal between that center one and the other IrisDuo in the same cluster. You could substitute any 2 or 3 millimeter bead. Again, you'll have to do some experimenting and see what works. Maybe check fire polish rounds. You could try even just using like 6/0 or 8/0 seed beads, depending on if you have a different bead you're using, you might need more space. So here's one cluster of 3 with 2 crystals in it. Now we're going to separate each of the clusters just with an 11/0. So I've got an 11/0 and I'm going to go through the first IrisDuo in the next cluster. Again, if you're using different beads, don't be afraid to experiment. This is my second tip, which is to swap out sizes of beads. If an 11/0 is maybe a little too big, try a 15/0. If you're working somewhere that I've told you to use 15s and they seem just a little small, try using an 11/0. Maybe that would be better than 2 15s. So experiment. Whenever you buy a pattern from somebody that has all of this figured out for you and they tell you exactly which beads to use, know that you are paying for all their time doing this experimenting, figuring out exactly what sizes work best and look best. I got my tail in the way, confusing me. There we go. So here's those 2 crystals in this cluster. So now we'll separate the clusters with an 11/0 and repeat all the way around. I'm just adding my last 11/0 to separate my clusters here. And you can see by adding the larger beads to the outside, that really helps make this thing lie in a circle and lie flat, because of course it gets bigger as we go further out. Next we're going to go through the next IrisDuo, and we're going to work our way back to the center so we can start adding our netting that will hold our crystal in place. So we're going to go through the IrisDuo, through the crystal, the IrisDuo, and the other crystal if you can. If you can't, do it in as many steps as you need to not break needles. That's probably why my needles are bent in a crazy shape. Then we'll go down through this IrisDuo and then step down through this hole so that you're coming out, if you're looking at it from the top, you're coming out of the right side of an inner hole of the IrisDuo. You can see that my stop bead is kind of in the way over here, so I am going to move over to the next cluster just to be out of the way of that stop bead for the moment. So I'm going to go through the IrisDuo, that inner 11/0, that we did in our first row, the middle IrisDuo of a cluster, and the leftmost IrisDuo of a cluster. And you can kind of tighten up your stop bead if you want, so things aren't flopping about. So here's a cluster of 3 IrisDuos. I am coming out the leftmost bead on the bottom on the left side. Next you're going to add 15/0s. Any color you want. In this one I use gold. I'm going to use 2 colors in this just to show you how the netting works. So 5 15/0s. And we're going to go through the same hole but coming from the opposite side, so those 15/0s are going to wrap around the point of that IrisDuo. And if you can, go through whatever beads you need to get to the left side of the next IrisDuo. So there, those 15Os are now wrapping around. Again, if you're using a different bead, you might need to change the number. Now here's another tip for you, is to use odd numbers for netting if you can manage it. It just makes it easier when we add on more netting. So now I'm going to pick up another 5 15Os. And again, I'm coming out the left side of that bead. I'm going to go back in the same hole from right to left. And you're going to repeat this, going through the next IrisDuo, adding 5 beads, back through the same hole. I'm going to do this until you have 8 loops of 5 15Os. Here we are with the 8 loops of 5 seed beads each around IrisDuos. Now if you've done it correctly, starting with an IrisDuo beside a center one, you should be finishing also beside a center one. And the way this is going to work is these two are going to be at the points of your shape. So we're not going to put any netting, we're not going to put any of those groups of 5 seed beads. I don't know how well you can see it on this one, but here's one group here, and here's one group here, but there isn't one around this bead because we want to pinch it in. So what you're going to do at this point is simply pass through this one into the next one, and then carry on making 8 more loops of 5 seed beads around the bottom tips or the inner tips of each of your IrisDuos. Remember, we started with 6 groups of 3 IrisDuos, so that's 18. And if we're doing 8 loops here and 8 loops here, well, that's 16. That leaves these 2 without any loops around them. So just go ahead and repeat and make your groups of 5 seed beads around the tips of each of these. One thing that I have trouble with is I will forget. So like I'll be here and then I'll try to put a loop down here. You want to come out the left, go back in from right to left with all of your loops, and that keeps you traveling in the same direction and makes the loops behave properly. If you come here down to this one and then put a loop here and then go through this one and go back around, it just sits a little bit differently. It would probably work, but it just looks a little bit different. It's not quite so even. So here are our 16 loops of 5 beads around the IrisDuos, all but these 2 that are going to be the points that are opposite to each other. Next, we'll add our second row of netting. You're going to step up through 3 beads of the 5. This is why we like to do odd numbers in netting, so that you can come out a center bead. If for some reason you have to do an even number, you'll need to go through the center 2 beads in order for it to come out even. Now at this point I'm going to switch to a different color 15O, but you can continue with the same one. I just want you to be able to see what I'm doing. So I'm coming out the center bead, the 3rd bead in this loop of 5, and I'm going to add 2 15Os and go through the center bead in the next loop of 5. And this is called netting, because when you pull it, this loop ends up becoming kind of a V, and if you keep doing it, then it ends up looking like netting. So we're going to repeat that 2 more times. And this is the part where I had to do a lot of trial and error, and that is another tip for you, is know that trial and error is just a part of the design process. And if you're figuring something out, if you have a unique shape and you're figuring it out, you're going to have to do some doing and redoing and pulling out and trying this number or that number, or this size or that size, until you find what works. It's just a part of the process. I had to do a lot of redoing here in this particular part before I got something that I thought looked good. Like I said, rounds are Rounds are pretty easy because you just, once you got it, you just do the same thing all around. But if you look at this, so we've got this shape, which of course is pinched, very narrow on the ends, and then it flares out and gets wide on these sides. So we have to compensate for that. And again, I don't know if you can see. So here's a loop of 5, and here's the 2 seed beads. Another loop of 5, and there's 2 seed beads. And then what you have to do in here, between these ones on the very edge, the very widest part, is add 3 seed beads to fill that gap nicely. And then we'll go back to 2 and 2 and 2. And then at the tip, at the point, we're only going to add 1. So you just kind of have to keep track of where you are. This will really start shaping your ring to conform to the shape of your crystal. So 1, 2, 3. Again, if I had 6, I'd have to go through numbers 3 and 4, the middle 2. And it looks nicer, a little bit more graceful, and not quite so clunky to have just go through 1 here. You can see how these are pulling that center bead up. So I've done my 3, and now we'll do 2 3 times. If you love tutorials like this that give you what you need to know to create a design for yourself, you might consider supporting this channel by becoming a patron. And if you are already a patron, thank you. You are the reason I'm able to keep making these YouTube videos free for everyone. This is one way you can tell if you've counted correctly, because your single bead should come right at this point, this center bead of a cluster that doesn't have the loop of 5 beads around it. And it does, so hooray. Now if you're finding this confusing, here's another tip for you. Make a sketch. This happens to be my plan for the back of the crystal, which I will do slightly differently. But I just roughly, you can tell I'm not great at drawing, but I just roughly drew this out and drew it in. I've got 7, 9, 3. So helpful. So if you get confused, just sketch it out, and that will really help clarify things in your mind as you're going along. So now I've done my single bead here at the point. Now I'm going to do 2 3 times, 3, which should be in the center, and then 2 3 times, and 1 at this final point. And here I am adding that last single bead at this point, which underneath the one of the point super duos. Remember to go through that 15-0. And now you can finish off your threads, and do finish them off in the 15-0s, because we're going to be going through the IrisDuos to add the netting for the back. So let's see how that is looking. Oh, that's really pretty. Kind of a different look than having all the same bead. Make sure you pull off the stop bead, pull that out, and then finish off those threads. So everything here is all tied off, and I'm ready to start making my back, which is what I did here. You could actually absolutely do this as the front. It's a little bit simpler. It uses less beads than what I did on the front. You could do either of these variations in either spot you want. And here is also where a sketch is really useful. It's just for yourself as a reminder. You know, I'll remember how I did that, and other lies we tell ourselves. Yeah, I just did this a couple months ago, and it would have taken me some time to figure it out again. So here's my little sketch. I've got about 4 feet of thread, and I have my stop bead back on there with a tail about 6 inches, just enough to tie in. And what we are going to do is just some loops around some of the beads on the sides. So similar to those loops that we did on each side here, except they're going to be bigger and we'll need less of them. So on this one, you can see it on the chart and you can see it here. On this one, beside this center tip one, we're going to do 7. Skip an IrisDuo, 7. Then we're going to do a loop of 9 around these 2 that end up being the very sidemost beads. on the design. And then 7 and 7. And then repeat for the other side. 7, skip 1, 7, 9 around 2, 7, skip 1, 7. So I will walk you through one side of that. The nice thing about using a stop bead is that you don't have to mess around with tying it off to begin with. You can tie it off once you're all done. So I'm going to actually put it here, because then it'll be kind of out of my way. So 7 15-ohs. By the way, I started with about 4 feet of thread, and that's going to be enough to do the back and also this little decoration around the outside edges, which you can skip if you don't want it. But it's just kind of pretty. So we got our 7 15-ohs, and remember we're just going to go in the IrisDuo, so not that 11-oh there. And the same way we did it before, from right to left. So coming out the left, we're going to go right to left. Then travel through whatever beads you need to get to the next IrisDuo. Remember, we're not doing a loop around this center point one. Remember, come out the left side for your loops and then go in right to left. 7 more. Now we're going to skip this next bead. So we just need to not skip it, we're going to go through it and not add any loops of beads around it. So I need to go through this 11-oh, through the IrisDuo, and then through the IrisDuo I want to make my next set of loops through. Hello, stone. Yes, you are beautiful. 7. And this is why I wanted you to finish off your threads on the front in the 15-ohs, so you wouldn't have too much buildup of thread in these IrisDuos to be able to do this. So now we're going to go a loop of 9 around these two that are on the very sidemost ones. So we'll go through the IrisDuo, the 11-oh between them, and now we add 9 15-ohs. So then we're just going to go back the same way, just like we were looping through one bead, except we're looping through 3. Okay. There's our loop of 9, you can see. Now we want to come out this one, do 7, skip this one, and then do 7, and then repeat around. So once that's done, you should have 5 loops on each side. 2 7s, then a 9, and 2 7s. So you're going to step up to the center bead again. So in this case, it'll be, in this loop of 7, it'll be the 4th bead. 1, 2, 3, 4. And we're going to add, so let's see, in between the loops of 7, so up at these ends, we're going to have 3 seed beads in between each loop. But from those along the side, because they're longer, it's that long straight edge I was telling you about that bulges out a little bit with the shape of your stone, we need more beads, so we need 5. So it depends on where you end up. If you change directions, you might end up in a different place than I am right here. I need to give that a tug. So I am at a loop of 7 leading to the loop of 9, so I'm going to add 5. We don't need to pop our stone in until we get about halfway around, and then we'll need to put that in so that these beads secure it in place, because that's the whole point. So we have 5 here, and now I'm going to find my center bead of these 9, so it would be the 5th one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you just think about it, if you have a longer edge, you're going to need more beads. You need a longer strand of beads. So another 5. And then to the center bead of this group of 7. So the 4th one. And now I'm going to this, from between these loops of 7, I'm going to do just 3 beads, because it's a shorter distance that needs to be covered. And you can kind of tell if it's going to work by just pulling it tight and seeing, is it smooth? Does it leave gaps? That's looking pretty good. Now you'll notice on my little chart here, right here, I indicated 0 between these top 2. So the thread would just go straight from here to here. But you can see on the piece I did, I must have forgotten to note it down, that I thought it needed a bead. And actually looking at it here, I think it needs 2 to fill in this gap, because there's a pretty good gap here and there's a little bit of a gap up here. So I'm going to put 2 here. And this is what I mean by that trial and error. You might have to make a couple pieces and you might have to pull out some thread to get it to be just so. So I've got 2 here. And at this point, I think I need to pop in my crystal. And that looks like that's going to hold it nicely. So now between these 2 7s on the corner, kind of, I'm going to do 3. Happens all the time. Just there we go. And now I'm going to do 5 to the center of this long loop of 9. And then 5 to the next loop of 7. And this is, like I said, where a chart is really useful to help you kind of keep track of where you're at. And now 3 to that next loop of 7. And I will do this chart a little bit more neatly. This will be a bonus for my patrons on the Patreon site. And yeah, I think 2 here. We'll fill that out and then finish, so that'll be 2 between these and then 3. Now I've got my 3 beads to finish my ring of netting. And what I want to do is, and you could do this on the front as well, it didn't seem necessary, but if it seems a little loose and floppy, what you can do is actually go around that inner ring of beads at least once, if not twice, and it's amazing how much just that single thread will tighten things up. Also, with this shaped bead, take a minute and before you tighten everything up, make sure that it's centered in there. And not, it's very easy for it to go a little cockeyed. So just take your time and get it placed in there nice and evenly. And then pull this snug and just go around this inner ring of beads at least once, and it will snug up everything beautifully. And I can already see having the 2 beads here makes it look much more complete. It just, I've got a gap in here where I only had 1. It's amazing how much one little tiny seed bead can do. There, all I did was go around once. You can see how much that's tightened it up. I think that's pretty centered in there. And now we can add a decorative border. You can skip this step if you want to, if you think there's enough going on. I'm just going to travel up one of these little legs back out to the outside holes of an IrisDuo. Up these into whichever is the closest hole, whichever is the hole that's most cooperative. Let's see, got it, maybe, there we go. And then up to the outside hole. Oops, and let's not do a buttonhole stitch. Here we go. And this part is really easy. I'm just going to add 15 O's around the outside of all the IrisDuos. I'm not going to add them around the crystals or the 11 O's that are on the outside, just the IrisDuos. So let's see. And you do this really the same way you did the loops around the inside, where you're going to come out. And of course, if you're left-handed, then you would just reverse this. You're coming out the side of your non-dominant hand and then going back in through the bead from your dominant to your non-dominant side. And that just adds a little ring around those. So I'm not going around the crystals, so I'll go through this next IrisDuo. Maybe. Sometimes, you know, if it insists on doing that, so it's insisted on going through the crystal, which I didn't want, I'll just let it and then back out. Sometimes it's easier. There. So just 15 O's around the end of each of the IrisDuos to decorate them. And in this case, I want to go through the crystal, and it doesn't want to. Go figure! Oh, that's kind of pretty. So you just repeat around. Now, I know this is a lot of information, so if you have questions or need clarification, that is what the comments section below is for. For beading on another elongated shape, check out my Elegant Black and Crystal Earrings video, which is part of a seed beading playlist I put together for you. Tie off your threads. I used a pinch bail for this and just hung it on a chain